All right, everyone, welcome. Thanks so much for joining us. Today's topic is on anti-Semitism, and we've got a couple facilitators here from the ADL, the Anti-Defamation League, to help us facilitate. I am Holly Mays, the Assistant Director of Governmental Affairs at Associated Students, and I'm also here to just help moderate, introduce our facilitators, and answer any questions. You'll notice that this session is being recorded. We are going to be posting a recording of this on our website for folks who weren't able to join to be able to watch this session at a later time. You'll also notice, or maybe you haven't, that the mute all function has been used for this session just to help with interruptions and things like that. So if you have any questions at all during the session, please utilize the raise hand function. And one of the facilitators or moderators will call on you and unmute you to ask your question. Or if you prefer to ask your question in the chat, go ahead and do that as well, and we can answer your question through there. And so now I'm going to introduce our facilitator, Vlad. He serves as the National Director of Programs on Anti-Semitism at the Anti-Defamation League. He joined the ADL in 2014 as the Associate Director for the Central Pacific region and leads the office's international affairs work, represents the ADL to leading social media and internet technology companies in Silicon Valley, and delivers all programs related to anti-Semitism and white nationalism. He earned his dual master's degrees in nonprofit leadership and Near Eastern Judaic studies from Brandeis University, I hope I pronounced that correctly, and also earned a BA in economics, thank you, and business management from the University of California in Santa Cruz. So thank you so much for joining and facilitating rather. And we also have Brianna, who I did not have a bio for, so I can't share any extra fun info, but she will also be here from the ADL to help us moderate and facilitate. So again, welcome, and I will pass it along.
And real quick, I just want to note regarding asking questions in the chat, if you want to do it to everyone, feel free to, but if you want to do it privately, you can choose any of us three and we can privately do that. But please send it to me because I know Vlad will be presenting, so he has a lot on his mind, so it might get answered more if you send it my way. Thanks.
Yeah, right on. Thanks, Brianna. And thanks, Holly, for that introduction. And thanks to all of you for taking time out of what I know are your very busy days to join us for this really important session on anti-Semitism. I'm going to share my screen now. I have a presentation to go along with my remarks. So, all right, can everybody give me a nod if you can see my screen? All right, cool. Right on. So, I want to start by introducing the Anti-Defamation League. Some of you probably know who we are, or at least have heard of our organization. We are one of the oldest civil rights and anti-hate organizations in the country. We were founded over 100 years ago to stop the defamation of the Jewish people and to secure justice and fair treatment for all. From the very beginning, that's been a part of our mission since the founding of our organization. That language appears in the original 1913 charter, and we really have always seen it as two parts of the same whole. Our founders, in their wisdom, recognized that you can't secure the rights of the Jewish community unless you secure the rights of all people, right? And in every generation, our greatest kind of civil rights luminaries have reminded us of that fact, that none of us are free until all of us are free, that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And so that has been the guiding principle for our work over the last 100+ years. Now, I wanted to highlight a few moments from that 100-year history. Back in the 1930s, we began our work tracking extremist groups that were operating here in the United States, particularly the German-American Bund, which is a pro-Nazi organization that was very much trying to stop the United States from entering into World War II on the side of the Allies against Nazi Germany. In 1954, we got involved in the Brown v. Board of Education case at the Supreme Court, the case that formally desegregated public schools in the United States. In 1964, we helped to pass the Civil Rights Act, working alongside the leaders of the civil rights movement. You can see Dr. King there behind LBJ signing that landmark document, that landmark law that's really considered, the sort of landmark piece of civil rights legislation. In 1965, we helped to pass the Voting Rights Act. Now, this was really important. At the time, there were counties that were a majority Black in the South where not a single Black American had ever cast a single vote, right? And that was because of the various kinds of disenfranchisement schemes that were put forward in order to stop Black Americans from exercising their constitutionally protected rights. So we helped to pass the 1965 Voting Rights Act to prevent those kinds of machinations. But unfortunately, a few years ago, the Supreme Court gutted the central piece of that important legislation, and our organization has been fighting ever since to restore that. In the early 80s, we helped pioneer the concept of hate crime laws. We conceived the very concept of a hate crime with the recognition that a hate crime has a broader impact than simply the more traditional crimes, right? Because you not only impact the direct target of a crime, say the person who was directly assaulted, but you also terrorize an entire community, right? If somebody is attacked on the basis of their Jewish identity, now the entire Jewish community is frightened, right? And thinking, are we going to be next? So because of the impact of a hate crime is broader than a traditional crime, the law needed to reflect that. So in 1981, we drafted the original model hate crime statute that has been the model that has been adopted at the federal level, as well as now in 46 different states. In 2009, we helped to update the nation's hate crime laws by passing the Matthew Shepard and James Byrd Jr. Hate Crime Prevention Act, which added several new protected classes to our hate crime law, right? So before you were protected on the basis of your race, religion, etc. And now in 2009, we added sexual orientation, gender identity, disability to the protected classes. In 2015, after working on this issue for decades, we finally achieved marriage equality in the Supreme Court case Obergefell v. Hodges. And last year, we helped to pass the first workable hate crime law in the state of Utah. And just weeks ago, working alongside our civil rights partners in Georgia, we finally succeeded in passing a hate crime law in the state of Georgia, which up until this point has not had one. Now, a little bit about your facilitator. So my name is Vlad Heiken. As you might have guessed by that name, I was born in the former Soviet Union, what was once the Russian Empire, specifically in what was once upon a time the Pale of Settlement. That is the borderlands of the Western Empire, western borders of the Russian Empire, where Jews were forced to live. Jews were not allowed to live in most parts of the Russian Empire. They were relegated to this to the western borderlands, right? And very much to serve as a physical buffer between the empire and any invading armies that might be trying to invade the Russian Empire. And in the Soviet Union, Jews were subjected to all kinds of discrimination. Everybody had to carry an identity card, right? And the identity card had your ethnic identity on the fifth line. So some people had Russian, some people had Ukrainian, Belarusian. And if you were so unfortunate as to have Jew printed on your identity card, this was a kind of scarlet letter that would follow you throughout life and would usually mean that you would face all kinds of discrimination in housing, education, employment, and so on. And at the same time, Jews were also not allowed to leave. We were essentially prisoners in our own state. And it took a international movement called the Soviet Jewry movement. And you could see some of the posters and photographs from that era. It took an international movement of Jews, as well as our allies, to really win the freedom of Soviet Jews. And to allow us to immigrate to places where we could fully, practice our religion, which was forbidden in the Soviet Union. The observance of Passover, of the Sabbath, was criminalized. The Hebrew language was criminalized. You couldn't speak Hebrew. You couldn't study Hebrew. It was, people did it in secret underground groups, and if they were found out, people were dragged off to Soviet work camps or prisons. And so this work is really personal to me. The issue of anti-Semitism is very personal to me. I came to this country in the late 80s as a refugee from state-sanctioned anti-Semitism in the former Soviet Union. I am the grandson of a Holocaust survivor. And I come from a country where 9 out of every 10 Jews was murdered during the Holocaust. So this is something that's very personal, and it's something I'm very passionate about. Now, before we get going, in the learning, I wanted to just set a few ground rules that I hope everyone can respect. Now, first of all, we're here to learn, right? I hope everybody has come to this session ready to learn with an open mind. I just want to ask that people respect other people's time. Don't be disruptive. If you don't want to be here to learn, that's quite all right, but others aren't. So I would just hope that people respect that. Number two, participate to the fullest of your ability. Community growth depends on the inclusion of every individual voice, right? So if you have a question, if you want to answer a question that I pose, please raise your hand. We'll unmute you and let you ask your question or make your statement. Number three, use I statements, right? Speak from personal experience. I hope that's pretty clear, right? Number four, ask clarifying questions as they come up. But if you have a broader question or something that's not necessarily related to the content, wait until the end. We're going to have a Q&A session at the end. And just use the raise hand feature and we'll call on you and unmute you. Number five, just be sensitive in your language. This content can be triggering for some people, and also for yourself. If this content is difficult for you, just know that you can take a mental or emotional health break. You can step away right from the computer. You can mute it for a while and just take the time you need to do some self-care. If we could throw up our first poll, Holly, I want to start there just to see where people are at in their knowledge. All right. So before we're talking about anti-Semitism, I thought it'd be worth just having a brief overview of who are the people that anti-Semitism targets. That is, who are the Jewish people? So we have a poll here. Who are the Jewish people? A religious group, an ethnic group, a race, A and B only, so both a religious group and an ethnic group, or all of the above. And we'll just give a couple of seconds for people to weigh in. All right, about 3/4 of you have now voted. Some people still weighing in. All right, so let's end the poll and show folks the results. All right, so there we go, very good. So most of you, 58%, the majority said that Jews are both a religious group and an ethnic group, but not a race. Nobody said that Jews are a race. A few of you said that all of the above. All right, so thank you very much for that poll. We can stop sharing and I'll move on to the next piece. Oh, do I have to do that? I guess I have to do that. One sec. Okay. All right, so who are the Jewish people? The Jewish people are not a race, but are multiracial. Jews come in all colors, shapes, sizes, backgrounds. As you can see here in this nice collage that I've put together of different Jewish people from different parts of the world, different communities. Jews are not just a religion, right? Not just a religious community, but a people and a nation with a religion. Right? If that's confusing, you can think of certain indigenous groups, right, who have a religious system or a system of belief that is native or indigenous to their group, but which also have a culture, a language, and other things that go into their identity beyond religion. Right, and so if you kind of limit it to only religion, you're going to miss a lot of what it means to be Jewish and what it means to be some of these other groups. Right, the notion that there's this kind of bifurcation between nation and religion is actually a relatively modern concept, and for many indigenous groups around the world, the religion or the faith of a group is very closely intertwined with their national identity. So Jews are scattered around the globe, right? In every country around the world, you will find a Jewish community or at least a few individual Jews. But Jews ultimately are indigenous to the Levant. That's the Eastern Mediterranean, what is now the area of Israel, Palestine, that part of the world. And the identity is still very closely tied to that part of the world, right? As we'll see. So to Jewish people, our place of origin, the land from which our culture, religion, tradition comes, is still very important to Jewish identity today. So the notion of a Jewish return to the land, right? Jews were exiled from our land by empires many years ago, thousands of years ago, in fact. But the notion for those 2,000 years in exile there was a very strong notion about a Jewish return to our homeland in the Eastern Mediterranean, right? And you can find this replete throughout Jewish scripture, in Jewish liturgy, prayer, right, which is always conducted facing Jerusalem. And Jerusalem is mentioned some, I think nearly 700 times in the Hebrew Bible, right? You can find the importance of the land in Jewish law. There's certain laws that say, for example, that one is able to divorce a partner if they refuse to join one in the ancestral homeland of the Jewish people, right? There are 613 commandments in Judaism, right? And many of those commandments cannot be fulfilled outside of the land of Israel, right? That's how integral the land is to the Jewish religion, the Jewish identity. In fact, the Jewish calendar, the Jewish year cycle, right, is tied to the agricultural and seasonal cycles in the Eastern Mediterranean, right? So when you have Jewish festivals, some of which are agricultural festivals, right, those are tied directly to the cycles in the Levant. And these festivals, many of these festivals conclude with the traditional greeting next year in Jerusalem, right? So here's an example of that from Jewish scripture. We find this in Psalms, right? The Lord doth build up Jerusalem. He gathers together the outcast of Israel, right? These are the exiled Jewish people scattered all over the world. Praise the Lord, O Jerusalem. Praise thy God, O Zion. Zion being, of course, the one of the names for the land of Israel broadly and specifically Jerusalem. So let's talk about anti-Semitism. First of all, what is it? And I'm going to ask you, some of you to maybe raise your hand, or use the raise hand function, and just weigh in. What are we talking about when we're talking about anti-Semitism? All right, not all at once. I know you're all very excited to participate. Just give us a sense. What do you think it is? Broad strokes. All right. Karsten, I see you raise your hand. All right.
It's prejudice and discrimination against Jewish people.
Great. Yeah, prejudice and discrimination against Jewish people. Prejudice being an idea, right, that you judge a people before getting to know them on the basis of their group identity as opposed to them as an individual, right? And discrimination is what? Is carrying those ideas into practice, right? Acting differently towards Jewish people than you would other people, enacting laws or policies within institutions that marginalize or treat Jewish people differently than other groups would be treated. Great. Thank you so much for participating. So a formal definition of anti-Semitism, first of all, a caveat about definitions. Definitions are fraught, right? There's no definition that can kind of be fully inclusive of every kind of phenomenon or manifestation of anti-Semitism. Nothing can be fully comprehensive as a definition. So they can be useful guidelines, right? And can help us understand a phenomenon, but they're not going to be fully comprehensive, right? So having said that, here's a definition that we use at ADL. Anti-Semitism is a form of prejudice, right, as you said, that is directed towards Jews as individuals and as a group. Anti-Semitism is based on stereotypes and myths that target Jews as a people, their religious practices and beliefs, and the Jewish state of Israel. All right. Now, when we're talking about stereotypes and myths, what kind of things are we talking about? And if you could use the raise hand function and just give us a few examples of what we're talking about when we're talking about anti-Semitic myths, stereotypes, etc. And again, this is a session on anti-Semitism, right? So we're learning about a prejudice. So feel free to speak freely and openly. We know that you are not saying these things in order to be anti-Semitic. We're trying to learn about anti-Semitism. So please don't be shy to say things that might be controversial or that show that you understand what some of these stereotypes are. All right, Riley, we have Riley raising their hand.
The Jews are like greedy people, kind of a thing.
Right. Okay. So one stereotype is that Jews are greedy, right? There's a lot of stereotypes related to Jews and money, right? Absolutely. What's another one?
That Jewish people control the money and the banks of the world.
Okay, great. Yeah. So there's we said money, right, and greed, and then the other thing you said was control, right? Anti-Semitism oftentimes has to do with notions of Jewish control, right? Domination, that sort of thing. Yeah, absolutely. Anybody else have some ideas? All right, so there's all kinds of stereotypes, right? Stereotypes about the way that Jewish people look, what they believe, right? What they practice. But here is some basic myths and tropes that are going to be kind of sort of the most common ones that you're going to experience, right? First of all is this notion of a deicide. Deicide literally means the killing of God, right? This is an ancient charge against Jewish people, that Jews are responsible for killing Jesus Christ, right? And you can imagine within the Christian world, right? Jesus Christ is, of course, the Messiah, the embodiment of divinity on earth, and a people who is charged as having, harmed and killed, who is, sort of the Messiah and the representation of divinity on earth. You can understand how those kinds of beliefs are going to animate violence and hatred against Jewish people, right? Secondly, the blood libel. Blood libel is another ancient idea going back to antiquity, that says that Jews participate in various rituals, right, that have to do with blood, the consumption of blood, usually the consumption of blood of non-Jews, right, usually of children. And today, over the centuries since this idea came on the scene, it is taken various kinds of forms, and we'll see a little bit of how we see that in the contemporary context. But this notion that Jews subsist on the physical bodies of non-Jews, originally Christian children, but now it is metastasized. This again is another trope that has animated violence, mass violence against Jewish communities for centuries. Third is this notion of disloyalty, right? The notion that Jews cannot be trusted to be loyal, patriotic citizens of the countries where they live, that Jews form a sort of fifth column, right? People who live amongst us, pretend to be us, but really want to do us harm or have the potential to do us harm. Right, and this relates to the next trope that I have here, which is this notion that Jews are not quite what they seem, right? That they are manipulative, that they are liars, that they are cheaters, that they have a nefarious agenda, that they cannot be trusted to mean what they say or be who they say they are. Right, and we see this manifesting in many different ways. Right, on the white supremacist right, you will see ideas about that Jews pretend to be white people in order to destroy the white race from within. On the left, sometimes you'll see ideas that Jews or Jewish institutions pretend to be progressives, pretend to care about civil rights, but are really something else. They really have a different agenda that is secret and that people don't know about, but that ultimately is harmful to progressive movements, to the nation, and so on. Next is this notion of power and control, right? We talked about that. This notion that Jews control the banking system, control the global media, control the weather, right? All kinds of notions of power, control, manipulation, domination, those sorts of things. And lastly, Holocaust denial, distortion, misappropriation, and abuse, right? So this takes many different forms, but essentially it uses the worst incident of anti-Semitic mass murder, genocide, right, which was the Holocaust, in order to harm Jewish people, right? And we'll see some of the ways that this manifests. And lastly, this idea that again was mentioned, the notion of Jewish greed, right, relation to power over money, over the banking system, over financial markets, that sort of thing. All right. So a few other things to know about anti-Semitism. Number one, it's enduring, right? Anti-Semitism is a phenomenon that is as old as the Jewish people themselves, right? So we're talking about thousands of years old. Anti-Semitism is lethal, right? We're not talking about a phenomenon that merely hurts the feelings of Jewish people, right? It results in mass murder, right? And we're not just talking about the Holocaust, right? The history of anti-Semitic lethality is very long and tragic, right? So even if you think about a few decades before the Holocaust, right, at the turn of the 19th and 20th century, you had a phenomenon known as pogroms, these waves of mass anti-Jewish violence that swept across Eastern Europe. the Pale of Settlement, where I come from, and resulted in the deaths of scholars. There's variance in terms of the numbers that scholars don't all agree, but somewhere in the ballpark of 100 to 200,000 Jews were murdered in the decades on either side of the turn of the century, 19th to 20th century. Anti-Semitism isn't merely animus or prejudice. It is that, but it has this additional element, which is this notion of conspiracy theory, right? That explains the various phenomena in our world, right? That's what conspiracy theories do. They take complex phenomena in our world and offer easy solutions, easy answers to what's going on in the world, right? Number 4, anti-Semitism is often political. It is wielded as a political tool, right? There's a very long history of that. Oftentimes it is used to derail movements that are pushing for social and political change, right? And we'll talk a little bit about that later. Number 5 is anti-Semitism adapts to the form that is most fitting to the context, right? Anti-Semitism has this incredible chameleonic quality, right? Which allows it to adapt to various religious, political, and social contexts and take the form that is going to carry the most weight or have the most power within that particular milieu, right? As a result of that sort of adaptive quality of anti-Semitism, the justifications that are given or the motivations that are given for anti-Semitism are oftentimes contradictory, right? You think about some of the stereotypes or tropes that are mobilized or weaponized against Jewish people. It's things like Jews are too rich and ostentatious, right? They throw their money around, etc. Versus they're too poor and penny pinching, right? There's been people like, so for example, the part of the world that I come from, Jews were very poor, right? They lived in essentially Jewish ghettos, right? And when they migrated to the United States or other parts of the world, they came with really nothing, right? And so whether Jews were well off or whether they were poor, from both ends, that could be mobilized against them, right? Jews are blamed for capitalism on the one hand and socialism on the other. It really depends on your vantage point, what you consider to be a source of evil in the world. If you consider capitalism, if you're on the left, if you consider capitalism to be a great source of evil in the world, then Jews can be blamed for capitalism. If on the other hand, you're on the right and you think that communism, socialism, etc., are the real ill in the world, then Jews can be blamed for that too, right? Jews are blamed for being pacifistic and unwilling to defend their countries. They can also be blamed for being too militaristic, for being warmongers. Jews are blamed for being rootless cosmopolitans on the one hand and being hyper-nationalists on the other. Jews are attacked for being too insular, right? Sticking to their own kind on the one hand. And they're also attacked for being a threat to racial purity through race mixing, assimilation, and that sort of thing. And of course, we also hear on the one hand, that Jews should go back to Palestine, get out of our countries and go back to Palestine. Or on the other hand, get out of our country and get out of Palestine, right? And finally, number 7, anti-Semitism is both similar to and distinct from other forms of prejudice, right? So anti-Semitism has to be properly understood as part of as a particular manifestation of a broader phenomenon and as one part of a broader matrix of oppression, right? Or what can be called xenophobia, intense or irrational hatred or fear of the other, of strangers, of the unfamiliar, right? So as I said, anti-Semitism shares things in common with other forms of bigotry or oppression. What are some of the ways that anti-Semitism is similar to other forms like racism, homophobia, misogyny, Islamophobia? Again, if you could raise your hand and just help us out by letting us know, how is anti-Semitism similar to other forms of bigotry? What does it share in common? How does it treat the targets of the oppression?
Not a hand raiser, feel free to put it in the chat to everyone too, and we can read that out either way.
Yeah, thanks. All right, we have one hand raised.
Sort of all these. Okay, in all these cases, it's making judgments based on things that can't really be controlled or decided by the individual.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah. So it strips the individual of their particularity, right, and of their individuality, right? These forms of bigotry treat people as a number. You're Jewish, I already know everything there is to know about you. You're Black, I already got you pegged, right? It denies people their individuality and treats them as part of some homogeneous mass that is usually treated as a caricature of the complex reality and diversity within a particular group, right? Thank you very much. That's very good. What other ways? What are the other ways that it's similar to other forms? What about double standards, right? We already mentioned this. Treating people, one group differently than you would another, right? Applying different standards, right? In fact, the word bigotry comes from the French word bigot, which has this connotation of a religious hypocrite. That is somebody who treats their religious group differently than they would a different group, right? A different set of standards by which you judge your group versus a different group, right? So double standards is another thing that is common across most forms of bigotry that you'll experience. What else? The use of stereotypes, for example, right? Caricaturing people with certain ideas about them, right? Demonization, right? Blaming people for certain social ills or political ills or other types of ills in your society. Scapegoating, right? So these are all ways in which anti-Semitism is similar to other forms of oppression. But all of these forms of oppression also have traits that are unique to them. They're not all the same, right? Anti-Semitism doesn't function exactly like anti-Black racism, which doesn't function exactly like homophobia, which doesn't function exactly like misogyny, which doesn't function exactly like Islamophobia. They all have their own particularities. So what is one way that anti-Semitism might be different from, or from other forms of bigotry or oppression, or what's something that is particular to anti-Semitism that distinguishes it from other forms? This one's a little bit tougher. We're going a little bit deeper here. Anybody have ideas about how anti-Semitism might differ from other forms? So, oh, there we go. Kaylin.
Yeah, I was going to say, I think one of the main ways that anti-Semitism can end up different from other forms is that sometimes it is a lot harder to differentiate, like in political discourse, the idea that sometimes something is either anti-Semitic or something is legitimate criticism. I feel like the line gets blurred quite a lot, particularly in political discourse, where sometimes something is perceived as being anti-Semitic and some other people will genuinely think it's not anti-Semitic, but actually a debatable instance that needs to be considered. And then there will be this additional almost like meta layer of anti-Semitism in terms of what your own judgment of whether or not something is anti-Semitic becomes its own potential instance of anti-Semitism, in that one might refuse to acknowledge that anti-Semitism actually is anti-Semitism and is instead calling it legitimate political belief or opinion.
Right. That's a very good point. So anti-Semitism is sometimes targets a country, right, or support for a country, specifically Israel, right? And it can be sometimes hard to distinguish what is a political speech, right, criticism of a nation's policies, etc., from a form of bigotry. Now, some other forms of bigotry also have those sort of traits, right? If you think about, for example, the words of our president, right, who said, Mexico's not sending its best people. They're bringing guns, they're bringing drugs, they're rapists, right? And some, I assume, are good people, right? Well, that was aimed specifically at a country, right? Mexico. But nonetheless, most of us, I think, understood this sort of racist undertones of that sort of thing, right? So that's very good. What else? There was another person who had raised their hand. All right.
I think also anti-Semitism functions differently than, I guess, in similar ways to Islamophobia, in terms of it being a threat to a religion and a threat to like our government and our nation's safety, where Islamophobia is often, the religion of Islam is often weaponized, and like its practitioners are often stereotyped to be violent, like committing violent acts of terror against our nation.
Exactly.
Jews are often thought to be more the silent infiltrators of our nation, and taking it over and committing unnoticed acts of terror. And both being thought of as like a threat, but in different ways.
Yeah, absolutely. That's perfect. This is a very high level of understanding here. Very unusual. That's exactly right. So I would actually argue that Islamophobia, as you rightly identified, is probably the closest corollary that we have to anti-Semitism, precisely because of what you identified as this sort of conspiracy theory. It has this conspiracy theory aspect of it, specifically about this notion of a threat to our government, to our nation, to our culture, right? This notion that the Muslims are coming to infiltrate our government and supplant our way of life with their cultural norms, to replace the Constitution with Sharia law, right? This sort of conspiratorial sort of aspect makes it very similar, and that's exactly what makes anti-Semitism unique, is this conspiracy theory aspect, but specifically this notion of Jewish power and control, right? This notion that Jews are extraordinarily or even supernaturally powerful is very different from other forms of bigotry. If you think about the target of a particular bigotry, the view that the bigot holds about the targeted group, it's sometimes very different from anti-Semitism. If you think about the anti-Black racist, to the anti-Black racist, the target of his bigotry, that is the Black community, is inferior, right? They consider them to be inferior, not as capable, maybe not as smart, whatever. That's very different from the anti-Semite. To the anti-Semite, the Jew is not inferior, maybe morally inferior, right? Greedy, avaricious, whatever, but very powerful, incredibly capable, right? Able to control whole financial systems, banking, the global media, the weather, right? This is very different. Anti-Semitism is distinct from many other forms, although similar to Islamophobia in this way, in that it alleges to punch up at its victims rather than punching down, right? Now, this has all sorts of implications, right? First of all, it is easy to overlook anti-Semitism as a legitimate or important sort of form of oppression or bigotry, because anti-Semitism tells people that no, Jews are rich, powerful, and privileged. So how can they be oppressed, right? And as a result of that, anti-Semitism is often dismissed, not treated with the same kinds of seriousness, right? Not regarded as being of equal import, right? It also means that Jews can be blamed for every sort of political, social, environmental, or other ill in society, right? Only a group that is seen as incredibly powerful and capable is going to be able to control whole banking systems, right? If you consider a group of people to be incapable, to be inferior, you're not going to have those same kinds of conspiracy theories about their vast power and control, right? And the other thing to remember is that because of this particular nature of anti-Semitism, it can sometimes embed itself among movements for social justice, equality, etc., right? Because it posits that the cause of these ills, the cause of inequality, the cause of wars, the cause of environmental destruction, the cause of poor family dynamics, all of these things are the Jews. And for somebody who is concerned about social justice, about equality, when they go out and they try to understand what is the root cause of these things, they have thousands of years of material telling them the Jews are at fault. So it's really easy to fall into the trap of anti-Semitism, even among people who are social justice minded, who consider themselves to be anti-racist, and so on. So when we're talking about anti-Semitism, we're talking about a phenomenon that is global in scale, right? And we did a study a number of years ago. It was the first study of its kind, where we surveyed over 100 different countries and territories around the world. We conducted tens of thousands of different surveys and polls. And what we found was that more than 1/4 of the world's population is deeply infected with anti-Semitic ideas, right? That's over 1.09 billion people. All right, if we could pull up poll number 2, get a little bit more of, see where people are in their knowledge about anti-Semitism. So Holly, if you could pull that up for us, thank you very much. All right, Jews represent 2% of the US population. What percent of hate crimes against a religious group target Jews? 5%, 13%, 37%, or 58%. So Jews are just 2% of the US population. What percent of anti-religious hate crimes target Jews or the Jewish community, Jewish institutions, synagogues, that sort of thing? All right, so about 3/4 of you have now voted. Just wait a few more seconds for the rest to come in. All right. A few more coming in. Okay. So maybe we'll end the poll and share the results. All right. So most of you, 61%, said that 37% of hate crimes that target a religious group are against Jewish people, even though Jews are just 2% of the American population. You were close, but the 22% of you that said it's 58% actually had it right. All right, so I'm gonna stop sharing. Oops, here. All right, so according to the FBI, who has been tracking hate crimes in this country since the 1970s, roughly 58% of all hate crimes that target a religious group target the Jewish community. That is, the Jewish community is targeted for anti-religious hate crimes at a greater rate than every other religion combined. And it's always been the case ever since the FBI started tracking hate crimes several decades ago. Now, even when you look across all categories of hate crime, that is, people who are attacked on the basis of their race, religion, national origin, sexual orientation, gender identity, disability, etc., Jews, who are just 2% of the population, represent between 12 and 13% of targets of hate crime, right? Which is to say that Jews are overrepresented among targets of hate crime by a factor of more than 6, right? So you are, as a Jewish person, you are more than 6 times as likely to be the victim of a hate crime as some other groups, right? Now, at ADL, we also do our own research. We have our own data that we collect, and we track hate incidents, anti-Semitic incidents across the country, right? So these include both the kinds of things that the FBI looks at, right? So hate crimes. Now, in order for something to be a hate crime, it first has to be a crime, right? So sometimes people think that hate crime laws are thought crime laws, right? That you can't hate somebody, you can't have a negative thought about people. That's incorrect. Hate crimes only are counted as hate crimes if there's a crime committed: vandalism, arson, assault, etc. So therefore, hate speech is not a hate crime. For our purposes, we track things that are legally actionable as well as those that aren't, but which give an indication of the level of anti-Semitism in a country, right? So we include things like anti-Semitic hate speech, harassment, and things in our stats. And what we found is that over the last 5 to 6 years, anti-Semitic incidents across the country have increased drastically. In fact, in 2019, we saw the highest number of anti-Semitic incidents on record, right? Whereas in 2013, there was just 751 anti-Semitic incidents. In 2019, there was over 2,100. Now, even more frightening than that is that in just the last couple of years, just since 2017, the number of violent anti-Semitic incidents has more than tripled, right? In just the last couple of years. Now, when we're talking about who is the source of the most extreme acts of anti-Semitic violence, that is extremism, extremist murders, it's these people.
Jews will not replace us! Jews will not replace us! Jews will not replace us!
All right, enough of that. So that was a clip from Charlottesville, right? It was the largest gathering of white supremacists in the country in decades, right? They came from all over the United States and descended upon Charlottesville with the pretense of protecting the Confederate statue, which was slated to be pulled down, right? Now, I was saying that the greatest number of the most extreme kinds of anti-Semitic violence are coming from this sector, right? In fact, when you look over the last decade, roughly 3/4 of all extremism-related murder in the United States was committed by far-right extremists, right? People with membership in or who are connected to right-wing, far right-wing ideologies, right? And when you look at those, right, of all the right-wing acts of extremist murder, about 3/4 of those were committed by white supremacists, right? Which is to say that today, white supremacy and the white supremacist movement represents the #1 greatest domestic terror threat in the country. When we're talking about threats to, in terms of physical violence to minority communities, this is where the threat is coming from. Now, I wanted to do another poll here to find out how much you know about this ideology of white supremacy. In the video, you heard them chanting a number of different things in this sort of Nazi-like torch-lit procession, right? Which was very much modeled after the Nazi processions during the era of the Holocaust. So they were chanting things like blood and soil, which is an anglicized version of Blut und Boden, which is the German, the Nazi slogan in German. But they were also chanting something else, right? Which is Jews will not replace us. What do they mean by Jews will not replace us? And Holly, if we could put up our third poll here. All right. What did the white nationalists at Charlottesville mean when they said Jews will not replace us? Did they mean that Jews will not take away our jobs or other economic opportunities? That Jews will not take our place as the dominant white class in America? That Jews will not replace the white populations with non-whites? Or that Jews will not supplant the Christian white foundation of the US with Judaism and Jewish culture? All right, responses coming in quick. All right, about 3/4 of responses are in. Just give it a few more seconds, maybe. As people. All right. Okay. So most of you have had a chance to vote now. And if we could just share the results. There we go. So the majority of you, 54%, said what they meant by Jews will not replace us is that Jews will not supplant the Christian white foundation of the US with Judaism and Jewish culture. 15% of you actually got the right answer, which is that Jews will not replace white populations with non-whites. All right, so I'm going to stop sharing. Okay. So what they actually mean is that they believe the Jews will not replace us slogan is a manifestation of what's called the Great Replacement theory, which is a pillar of contemporary white supremacist ideology. What it says is, of course, as usual, they believe that Jews are plotting to destroy the white race. And they have various machinations by which they try to do that. One of the ways that Jews are trying to destroy the white race, white nations, white societies, etc., is by flooding them with non-whites. Muslims, Syrian refugees, Latinos, Hispanics, right? Asylum seekers, right? In order to supplant, quote unquote, the rightful white population of quote unquote white nations with people who don't belong there, non-whites, right? In order to take these countries, these nations away from whites, right? So, and this is, by the way, the ideology that motivated the worst act of anti-Semitic mass violence in U.S. history in Pittsburgh just a couple of years ago, right? At the Tree of Life synagogue, where a white supremacist walked in and murdered 11 Jews as they prayed. It was also the ideology or the particular idea that motivated the killer in the El Paso shooting at Walmart, who targeted Latinos and immigrants. It was also the idea that motivated the white supremacists who walked into a mosque in Christchurch, New Zealand, and murdered 50 Muslims as they knelt in prayer. Right. So this is an idea that is taking the lives of not only Jews but other minority groups as well, who are considered to be part of this plot. Right. So I want to ask here now, and again, if some of you could raise your hand and help us to understand, you know, if the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville was organized to protect the Robert E. Lee Confederate statue, why were they chanting "Jews will not replace us"? What did the Jews have to do with it? Why is the Jew so central to white supremacist ideology? So who's got an idea? If you could raise your hand and just help us to understand this, we'd be very grateful. All right, Sabina.
They're looking for a scapegoat.
Okay, looking for a scapegoat. Yeah, very good. All right, Kaylin.
It's easy to pin a lot of left-leaning or liberal policies on Jews. It's a common stereotype, as we discussed earlier. So it connects to the scapegoat thing that Sabina just brought up, but they're the orchestrators and the masterminds behind this.
Right. Yep. There was somebody else too, Gerline.
I was thinking it might have something to do with religious differences between Christianity and Judaism.
Okay, yeah. All of those things are true. Absolutely. I think there's, Sophia?
Yeah, like with Christianity and Judaism, like white supremacy is often tied to some degree to the maintenance of like maintaining Christianity as the cultural center of the nation, and Jews and Judaism are often believed to be like at the center of the murder of Jesus and therefore the murder of Christian culture.
Right. So maintaining Christian hegemony and seeing Jews as a threat to the maintenance of Christian hegemony. Yeah, very good. You on Lee?
I was thinking something along the lines of white supremacists blurring their idea of patriotism with the threat of, I guess, a so-called outside force, where they feel as though their country, as in the United States, is being threatened by I suppose an external invader.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so white supremacists view Jews, of course, as non-white, right? But also as not quite American, right? That Jews are a foreign sort of threat to the United States. So all of that is correct. But to be more specific about it, here is a quote from a man named Eric Ward. He is a longtime civil rights strategist, a researcher of white nationalism. Oh, I went too far. A researcher of white nationalism and the current head of the Western States Center. He writes, "What is the arch nemesis of the white race, whose machinations have prevented the natural and inevitable imposition of white supremacy? It is, of course, the Jews. Jews function for today's white nationalists, as they often have for anti-Semites throughout the centuries, as the demons stirring an otherwise changing and heterogeneous pot of lesser evils." Right? So what is he saying here? Anybody want to help us out to try to decode what he's saying? Specifically, Jews are the arch nemesis of the white race, whose machinations have prevented the natural and inevitable imposition of white supremacy. Any ideas what he's talking about? No ideas. Oh, one idea. All right, Riley.
Is it that they think that white nationalism is something that would have happened naturally if not for the Jews? As in, if the Jews weren't here, then this thing that we know is right would have already occurred.
Exactly. In fact, here's another quote. Anti-Semitism, Eric Ward says, "Anti-Semitism is the fuel that white nationalist ideology uses to power its anti-Black racism, its contempt for other people of color, and its xenophobia, as well as the misogyny and other forms of hatred it holds dear." And he adds, "Black people will not win our freedom without tearing it down." The corollary to that, of course, is Jewish people will not win our freedom without tearing down white supremacy and anti-Black racism, right? What he's talking about is that you have to go back to the civil rights era to understand what he's talking about. Now, remember, before the civil rights era, white supremacy was the law of the land, right? The country lived under a code of discriminatory legal policies known as the old Jim Crow, right? And it was through the activism, agitation, the lobbying, the marching of Black organizers, as well as their allies, that dismantled what was the old Jim Crow, the system of legalized white supremacy that was dominant in the country, right? And now, if you think about it, right, if you believe if you believe in white supremacy, right, if you're a true believer and you truly believe that the white race is the superior race and that black people are inferior, then how could it be that the whites lost to the blacks? How could it be that the superior white race was beaten and outmaneuvered by these quote unquote inferiors, right? These black organizers, marchers, civil rights activists. How could it be? They need an answer in order to maintain their ideology intact. And their answer, of course, was pulled from traditional, classical sort of anti-Semitic ideas, right? The notion that Jews are this incredibly powerful force, right? And they looked at the civil rights era and they saw that the most prominent non-Black presence in the civil rights movement was the Jewish community, right? The majority of civil rights lawyers working in the South at the time were Jewish. The majority of non-Black freedom riders during the Freedom Summer action were Jews. Jews helped found the NAACP, et cetera. And so white supremacists determined that the reason that they lost, what stopped the inevitable imposition of white supremacy, the domination of the white race over the other races, was this Jewish presence, right? That they were, the reason that we lost was because this powerful Jewish force undermined us, right? And prevented us from maintaining Christian hegemony, white hegemony in this country, right? And when we look at the statements of the white supremacists themselves, they talk about this over and over and over again, right? Our team at ADL, at the Center on Extremism, tracks white supremacists on a daily basis, infiltrates their forums, studies what they're talking about, right? So here's something that was leaked from the Daily Stormer playbook, right? The Daily Stormer is the most popular white nationalist, white supremacist, neo-Nazi, anti-Semitic site on the internet. And somehow their playbook got leaked a few years ago. In it, the founder and proprietor of the Daily Stormer, which is named to sound like Der Stürmer, the old Nazi publication, Andrew Anglin talks about sort of his strategy for using this site as a propaganda tool, right, to spread anti-Semitism and the ideology of white nationalism. He says that all enemies should be combined into one enemy, which is the Jews. This is pretty much objectively true. If we didn't have the Jews, we could figure out how to deal with non-whites. Same deal with women. Women should be attacked, but there should always be mention that if it wasn't for the Jews, they would be acting normally, right? The Jews should always be the beginning and the end of every problem, from poverty to poor family dynamics, to war, to the destruction of the rainforest, right? So you see here what Eric Ward was talking about, right? That the Jews are these demons that are stirring an otherwise changing and heterogeneous pot of lesser evils, right? That ultimately everything goes back, all of our problems go back to the Jews. Put more succinctly, Jews are enemy number one. Jews are the virus. People of color, homosexuals, they're the symptoms. This is a quote from a member of Atomwaffen, which is considered to be one of the most violent white supremacist terror groups in the United States. And of course, this is also spread visually, right? On the internet, in propaganda events, right? So on the upper left, you see a group called Vanguard America that has been active in the Santa Barbara area, and a banner of theirs that says, "Feminists deserve the rope." This is a white supremacist, neo-Nazi, anti-immigrant, anti-Muslim, anti-Semitic organization, but they are also anti-women, right? Anti-feminism. Why? Because they believe that feminism is a Jewish plot to destroy the white race, as everything is, everything that they hate, right? How? Well, if you turn white women against white men, they stop having babies, end of white race, right? Below that, we see another caricature that shows the nexus between anti-Semitism and Islamophobia, right? And again, here you see this notion of the Great Replacement theory, right? That we talked about earlier, right? The notion here, you see this evil-looking Jew putting a sword that says Islam through France specifically, right? The notion here is that Jews are destroying European white societies by using other minorities, other ideologies, other religions, right, against them, right? So you see this nexus between anti-Semitism and other forms of bigotry that white supremacy holds dear, in the words of Eric Ward. On the right, you see another cartoon using the same image of the Jew. This is the most popular and widespread anti-Semitic image on the internet. called The Happy Merchant, right? And you see this notion that the Jews are saddling the hardworking white man with all of this debt, and taking their taxes and giving out all this money to blacks, to the LGBTQ community, immigrants, drug addicts, other people, right? So again, you see the way anti-Semitism fuels all of these other forms of bigotry. Now, as we said, anti-Semitism is adaptive. It's able to find fertile soil across the entire political spectrum and in different social, political, and religious contexts, right? So here's the same idea, the notion that kind of all of the world's ills can be blamed on the Jews, but this time not from an American or Western white supremacist Christian source, but from the Middle East, from a Muslim source. But the idea is the same, right? This imam, or religious cleric, is saying the Jews are behind each and every catastrophe on the face of the earth. And sometimes those very same ideas are projected onto not just Jews as individuals, not just Jews as a community, but actually onto the Jewish state. So here we see Hamid Dabashi, who's a professor at Columbia University, essentially airing the very same idea that Jews, or in this case, the Jewish state, is behind every sort of social, political, religious, environmental, other ill in the world, right? He says every dirty, treacherous, ugly, and pernicious act happening in the world, just wait a few days and the ugly name of Israel will pop up. Now, returning to the question of white supremacy. So I mentioned that this is sort of the greatest domestic terror threat facing minority communities, not just Jews, but other minority communities as well. And like any ideological movement, they know that in order to gain the political power that they need in order to drastically reshape the country in their image, that is to make it a white Christian ethno-state where no Jews, no Muslims, no black people, no gay people, no trans people, etc., right, would be allowed. They need to spread their ideology. All ideological movements come to power on the basis of the adoption of their ideas into the mainstream, right? And white supremacists have been very, very busy propagandizing, spreading their ideas, which essentially includes anti-Semitism. So in 2017, our team counted 428 white supremacist incidents of white supremacist propaganda across the US. But by 2019, that figure was at over 2,700. And as you can see, many of these things are happening also on campuses, college and university campuses, but they're actually targeting kids as young as middle school because they believe young people are, of course, young, impressionable, right? Okay, so, and this is what some of that propaganda looks like, right? You have, of course, they use patriotic themes, red, white, and blue, right, etc. The notions that the land of the United States wasn't stolen, it was conquered. They're very proud of this sort of warlike colonial past of the United States. Of course, anti-Semitism is a central theme, right? So you have in the middle there this poster, why did Jews push pornography and degeneracy on our children, right? And on the right, of course, Holocaust denial is also a major feature within this propaganda, right? This flyer says Holocaust equals fake news. So some of the groups that are the most active in spreading white supremacist propaganda include Patriot Front, which is a white supremacist group that engages in these sort of flash mob demonstrations, torchlit marches like we saw at Charlottesville, etc. They espouse racism of every kind, anti-Semitism, as well as intolerance against immigrants, the LGBTQ community, etc., under the guise of, quote, preserving the ethnic and cultural origins of their European ancestors, right? As I mentioned, they say that their ancestors conquered the land and then bequeathed it solely to whites, that this was always intended to be a white nation, not for Jews, not for Muslims, not for Latinos or anybody else. Another group is Identity Europa. They recently rebranded as the American Identity Movement. They were founded in the spring of 2016 here in California, actually, with the goal to recruit young people who do not openly appear to be sort of white supremacists, right? They're very careful about telling their members to cover their tattoos, right? To dress respectably, right? And this is very much with the idea, again, that they want to mainstream their ideology, right? They want their ideas to be respectable. And so they have cast off their swastikas and their jackboots, and today they dress in polos and khakis, right? They hide their racist tattoos, etc. And oftentimes when they hold their rallies, their demonstrations, etc., it's under the guise of free speech. They claim to be nonviolent, right? And that they're all only kind of standing up for our First Amendment free speech rights. But as you can see on the bottom right there, this is the founder of Identity Europa, its former leader, punching a young woman in the face, right? So this notion that they are nonviolent is a cover for some very violent activities that they engage in. These people have targeted the UCSB and the broader Santa Barbara area. Here are a few examples that our team has collected from Santa Barbara, right? So you see some of these groups that I mentioned, Vanguard America, that had that lovely Feminists Deserve the Rope flyer, or a banner, excuse me. And then you also have Patriot Front, right, on the left, which is another kind of fascist organization. They have as their symbol the fasces, right, which is a symbol of fascism, right? Now, I want to talk about a little bit more about this this idea of anti-Semitism having this sort of adaptive quality, that it can find fertile soil across the entire political spectrum in different social, political, religious, and other contexts, right? And I want to use the example, the contemporary example of what's going on in our country today, right? Our country and really the world has been swept by the Black Lives Matter movement, right? Protesters who are drawing attention to the pervasive racism within our criminal justice system, which has cost the lives of countless Black Americans. Breonna Taylor, Eric Garner, George Floyd, and so many others. Well, so we've seen anti-Semitism on both sides of sort of the debate or the controversy that has erupted with these protests, right? So on the left, right, we've seen ideas that the Jewish community, through sponsoring certain trips to for law enforcement to train with their Israeli counterparts, are responsible for the violence against Black and brown communities in the United States, right? The notion that through coming into contact with law enforcement in Israel, they are learning something. They're becoming infected with a sort of a violent hatred of Black and brown people, and that they are learning techniques which they then use to brutalize Black and brown people in the United States. On the other side, on the right, sort of the political right that is sort of opposed to the Black Lives Matter movement, you have a different sort of conspiracy theory about Jews. Here's a quote from Candace Owens, who's a conservative political commentator, that says that the Minneapolis chief of police confirmed that many of the protesters that are burning down the city are not from Minneapolis. My guess, as he did with Antifa, Democrat George Soros, who's a Jewish philanthropist, has the thugs on a payroll. He is funding the chaos, right? So this is a very old notion, goes back over 100 years to the Protocols of the Elders of Zion. This notion that Jews are use sort of political movements, right, in order to undermine nations and societies, to cause civil unrest, right? And you see this with the way that these same ideas are being weaponized today to suggest that, you know, these protests aren't an organic outgrowth, an organic reaction to the real legitimate problems of racism that we have in our country. No. There's no real problems with racism. It's all a plot of the Jews who are simply, who are paying these people to go out and loot and burn and demonstrate as a way to undermine our nation, right? That none of this would be happening. There's no real problem with racism in the United States. None of this would be happening if it wasn't for the Jews, right? I suppose it has to be said, right, that the United States has a very, very long history of brutalizing Black and brown people, right? The United States has never needed anybody to teach it how to be brutal to Black and brown bodies. At the same time, America has never needed anybody to teach us how to demonstrate and to march against and to resist violence against Black and brown bodies, right? This is an attempt to essentially scapegoat a minority group and thereby to escape the responsibility and that we all have as American citizens to deal with the very real problems that we have in the United States, right? By suggesting that the only reason this is happening is because of Jews or Israel, by suggesting that there's no problem at all, actually. It's just the Jews making it up. The Jews are using their media to stoke the flames of unrest, et cetera, right? Now, here's another example of the ways that this also shows up in sort of anti-Zionism, right? So here's a caricature of a political cartoon that it has been passed around on the white supremacist far right, right? There's this caricature of the Jews stealing money out of this sort of collection plate from this poor family who's panhandling on the street. Their sign says federal poverty programs, right? So the Jews are stealing from poor Americans from federal poverty programs. And it says, this Jew is saying, be a patriot, goy. Somebody's got to pay $10 billion to Israel. The notion here, of course, is that America cannot take care of our people, right? Because the Jews are bleeding us dry and sending all of our money to Israel. So this is on the white supremacist far right. Here you have the very same notion being expressed from the left. Here's an outlet called Feminist News. I pulled this from my own timeline. I follow this outlet, Feminist News, which does a lot of reporting about issues of gender equality and the like, obviously from a left progressive perspective. But they're airing the very same idea. Tell me again why US taxpayers send Israel $3 billion every year. They can enjoy free healthcare, college, housing, and we don't get shit. Essentially, again, blaming the problems that we have within the United States on the Jews, right? Saying that the Jews are bleeding us dry and that's why we can't take care of our own. This idea isn't new. It actually goes back a very long time. And I pulled this from Soviet propaganda, right? I mentioned at the very beginning that the Soviet Union was institutionally anti-Semitic, right, as a matter of policy. And so this is a form of political propaganda that was used. And this political cartoon essentially says exactly the same thing. You have these two destitute Americans, one of whom is apparently blind on the right, and this Israeli soldier representing Israel, right, and the Israeli military. Uncle Sam is pulling up and dumping all this cash into their sack, right, and the people, the Americans that are destitute on the side get nothing, right? And the caption in Russian on the bottom says something to the effect of, if only we were closer to the political establishment, maybe we could get a little bit, maybe we could get a little bit of something for ourselves as well. So the ideas, these ideas oftentimes are circulated and cross-pollinated from different sectors, right? Anti-Semitism has this chameleonic quality, right? So an example is the notion of Zionism as imperialism, right? Which you've probably heard. It's very common to hear on college campuses today. Zionism is imperialism, Zionism is colonialism. Well, that idea actually comes, again, from this campaign of anti-Semitic propaganda that was wielded by the Soviet authorities, by Soviet intelligence in particular. The highest ranking defector from Soviet intelligence, Ion Pacepa, said that imperial Zionism was a Moscow invention, a modern adaptation of the protocols of the Elders of Zion, and a long favorite tool of Russian intelligence to foment ethnic hatred, right? So what they basically did was they took this ancient tract called the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which was created by the monarchist secret police, right? This is a right-wing Christian Russian Orthodox monarchist regime, right? Created this fabrication known as the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which alleged that the Jews have this plot of world domination, right? Now, this right-wing reactionary text that was created by the Tsarist right-wing secret police decades later was picked up by the leftist communist Soviet authorities in order to use as a blueprint for their anti-Semitic propaganda, right? So you see the cross-pollination from the political right to the political left. and back again, because in the subsequent decades, right-wing nationalist movements across the United States, across Europe and other places in the world also picked up on this and ran with it, and they serve today as the basis for much of the anti-Semitic propaganda that you hear. All right, so I want to talk about this sticky subject of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism, right, which was raised earlier in our talk. This is I pulled this from the State Department, the U.S. State Department website. It is a definition of anti-Semitism that was embraced under the Obama administration's State Department, and it uses the working definition of anti-Semitism by the European Monitoring Center on Racism and Xenophobia. Basically says anti-Semitism is a certain perception of Jews which may be expressed as hatred towards Jews. Rhetorical and physical manifestations of anti-Semitism are directed towards Jewish or non-Jewish individuals and or their property, towards the Jewish community institutions and religious facilities. But then it also has this other component, right, where it talks about what anti-Semitism looks like in regard to Israel or Zionism, right? And though the first thing I want everybody to note is on the bottom right, the very last sentence says, criticism of Israel similar to that leveled against any other country cannot be regarded as anti-Semitic. In order to help us understand where those lines are between criticism of a state, its policies, its politicians, etc., and hate speech, anti-Semitic hate speech, they use a formulation or a framework called the 3 Ds. The 3 Ds are demonization, double standards, and delegitimization, right? So for example, if you are doing quote unquote criticism of Israel, but you are using these kind of classical tropes and stereotypes, right, that we talked about early in the presentation, that is considered anti-Semitism. So let's take a look at what that looks like in the contemporary setting, right? So here's a couple of political cartoons, right, that traffic in a classic trope of anti-Semitism. Anybody recognize which particular trope of those tropes and stereotypes that we discussed early in the presentation appears here in these images? Does anybody recognize the particular anti-Semitic trope? Now you'll notice both of these are attacking the state of Israel, right? On the left you have, if Jesus came to Israel today, right? On the right, you see this Israeli soldier. Maha, yes, thank you so much.
I forgot the exact term, but it's like the trope of like Jews is like the killer of God.
Yeah,
or just
exactly,
like,
deicide.
Yeah, deicide.
Deicide, yeah. So this mobilizes or weaponizes the ancient trope of deicide, the notion that Jews killed Jesus, right, to attack Israel as a state, right? Obviously, this isn't a criticism of a particular Israeli policy. This isn't a criticism of a particular Israeli politician, all of which would be fine. But what it does is it uses an ancient anti-Semitic trope, which has been used to mobilize violence, mass violence against Jewish communities for centuries, in order to do what is called Israel criticism, right? Let's take another look. What anti-Semitic stereotype do you see here? Anybody want to raise their hand and offer a guess? Yes, Riley, thank you.
I think it was blood libel was the term.
Yep, you got it. Blood libel, right? So this notion that Jews subsist on the bodies or the blood or the organs of non-Jews, right? And I want to bring your attention specifically to the image in the upper right. I pulled this from Facebook. This is Bassem Tamimi is a Palestinian, a well-known Palestinian activist, but he's run into, unfortunately, a bit of an anti-Semitic trope here, right? He says in this Facebook post that he shared, actually, excuse me, I want to be clear. It's a post that he shared from somebody else, so these aren't his words. But nonetheless, this is something that he shared on his Facebook account. And it says, when Israelis arrest Palestinian children, what is the purpose? To steal their organs, right? And then, of course, he adds the same Zionists doing this, control the media, right? And a whole bunch of other anti-Semitic tropes, right? So you see here some of the ways in which these classical anti-Semitic tropes are used to attack Israel in some cases. Again, not a critique of policy, doesn't help advance us towards a resolution of the conflict. It's simply anti-Semitism. What about this? So you see 2 cartoons by a cartoonist named Ben Deeb. and who uses a lot of these kind of anti-Semitic themes in his cartoons. Do you recognize which trope is being weaponized here? There's actually a couple, just as there was in the last one. But anybody recognize which tropes these might be? So you see the U.S. Capitol, the Houses of Congress, right here. You see this this Jew. It's supposed to be, I believe, Ariel Sharon, the former Prime Minister of Israel, on the left as this sort of puppeteer. Anybody want to raise their hand and wager a guess as to what tropes we're seeing here? You on Lee, yes, please.
Is it power and control?
Power and control, exactly, right? So this notion that the Jews control the United States government and the EU, right? On the left, the Jews as these sort of puppeteers pulling the strings behind the scenes, right? This is very akin to old Nazi propaganda that utilized the puppet master image. It's also been utilized on mainstream television by people like Glenn Beck, right? Who said that George Soros is this sort of puppet master controlling the strings behind the phenomenon in the world, et cetera, right? On the right, you see the notion that the Capitol building, right, the halls of Congress where our politicians make our laws, are under Jewish control, right? That this is, and you see these money bags along the bottom of the Capitol, meaning the Jews are perverting our politics with their money, right, controlling us through finances, et cetera, right? All right. Here's another one. This one's pretty obvious, I hope, right? This is the trope of Holocaust distortion, denial, misappropriation, Holocaust abuse of various kinds, right? So we see this notion that Zionism is Nazism, right? You see the equation between the Star of David or the Israeli flag and the swastika or the Nazi flag. This notion that the Israelis are doing to the Palestinians what the Nazis once did to the Jews, right, perpetrating a genocide. And then on the bottom right, you have this was a picture here in California, Northern California. These individuals were holding this banner over the freeway that said the Holocaust is a lie. So all kinds of forms of anti-Semitism in the form of Holocaust denial, but these are also oftentimes weaponized against Zionism and against the state of Israel. Zionism being, of course, the simple idea that Jews should have a Jewish state of their own, right? Anybody know where I'm going with this one? So here we have hopefully a recognizable figure, right, on the political stage. On the right is Bernie Sanders, a Jewish member of Congress for many years, who ran for president both in 2016 as well as in this last presidential election. And Bernie Sanders went on a talk show with Diane Rehm, who's on the left there. Diane Rehm is a relatively mainstream sort of talk show host. She's not a conspiracy theorist. She's not a bigot or anything like that. But she asked Bernie Sanders, Senator Sanders, given the fact that you have dual citizenship with the state of Israel, how can people trust you to faithfully represent the interests of Americans and not put Israel's interest first? Something to that effect, right? Bernie was taken aback. He was quite shocked, but he answered that, wait a minute. First of all, I don't have dual citizenship with Israel. I only hold American citizenship and always have. And secondly, I've served in Congress for many years, and I've always put, the interest of the constituents that have voted me into office first. Where's this question coming from? Well, it turns out one of her staffers, one of Diane Rehm's staffers, pulled this notion from the internet. Every single Jewish member of Congress has at some point faced the conspiracy theory or the charge, the accusation that they are an agent for Israel, that they will always put Israeli interests first, right? That they're not going to faithfully represent American interests, right? Now, this notion is actually relatively widespread. In our polling, we found that nearly 1/4 of the American people believes that Jews are more loyal to Israel than they are to the United States. That is, Jews cannot be, fully trusted to be loyal, patriotic Americans. They will always put the interests of Israel first, right? This is a really dangerous and old, probably one of the oldest anti-Semitic canards in history, right? And it's also the most widespread. Globally, roughly 41% of the global population believes that Jews are more loyal to Israel than they are to the countries where they live and hold citizenship. right? And you see these ideas trafficked again from many different sectors, from many different sectors of the political spectrum, etc. So here's, for example, a quote or a tweet from David Duke, no longer on Twitter. He was finally booted off Twitter. But in this tweet, he says, he quotes the Honorable Minister Louis Farrakhan, right, using his honorific. Now, this might seem strange to some people, right? Like, why is the former head of the Ku Klux Klan quoting and using his honorific, doing so very respectfully, quoting a black man, right? Well, the reason is because where it comes to Jews, even though they disagree on almost everything else, David Duke and Louis Farrakhan agree where it comes to the Jews. Louis Farrakhan said, ask any Jew, even your son-in-law. He's of course talking to Donald Trump, whose son-in-law is Jared Kushner, a Jewish individual. Ask any Jew, even your son-in-law in America. America is never first. Israel is always first, right? Again, this notion that Jews aren't patriotic Americans, they are a fifth column who's going to do us harm, right, etc. And I want to just point out, oftentimes people think that that anti-Zionism, right, is a left-wing phenomenon, right? It's not, right? That's a misconception, right? In fact, in 2019, our audit of anti-Semitic incidents showed that roughly 40% of incidents that of anti-Semitic incidents that referenced Israel or Zionism were committed by white supremacists. Right, and what anti-Zionism is rife on among the white supremacist far right. Right, so here's another few quotes from David Duke, the former head of the Ku Klux Klan. The Zionist-influenced media around the world continues to lie to us. We must free the West and the whole world from Zionist globalist tyranny. Right, globalist is a code word or a dog whistle, right, for Jews. As Zionist is also sometimes used as a sort of dog whistle or code word that way. Here is another quote from a former nominee for the Illinois legislature, right? He actually won a sizable portion of the votes, I think about a quarter of the votes, which is quite frightening. And he says, we stand for America, we stand for the white race, we stand for the Christian foundation of this country. We are going to smash the queer movement, we're going to destroy the Zionist movement, we're going to crush the black criminal movement, and we're going to deport all these illegal aliens that are imported in here, taking away jobs from Americans. That's what we're going to do. That's what this party is all about. So again, you see this sort of nexus, this sort of connection between anti-Semitism. Here, you know, he doesn't say Jews, he says Zionists, right, or the Zionist movement. But you see the way that anti-Semitism is inextricably interrelated with anti-Black racism, homophobia, transphobia, right, anti-immigrant xenophobia, etc. And here's a charming gentleman by the name of Patrick Little, a former candidate for the Senate here in California. And he says, the Jews have controlled this country for a very long time. We're an occupied government. This is a Zionist occupied government. We do whatever the hell Israel wants, right? The most common way that white supremacists refer to the notion that the Jews are controlling the US government is ZOG, the Zionist occupied government. So we're getting to the end here. I realize we're almost up on our time. I just want to show this teaching tool that we use called the Pyramid of Hate, right? And what it shows is the way that bigotry escalates if left unchecked, right? At the bottom of the pyramid, the largest portion of the pyramid is the most common forms of bigotry, right? And this applies as much to anti-Semitism as it does any other form, right? At the bottom of the pyramid are things like stereotyping, fear of difference, right? Certain ideas, right, about people, etc. Now, if those ideas aren't confronted at that level, they will turn into acts of bias. That is non-inclusive language, insensitive remarks, microaggressions, social avoidance, ridicule, name-calling, slurs, racial slurs and epithets, racist jokes and dehumanization, right? And again, if we don't stop it at that level, it will always escalate to the next level, which is systemic discrimination. That is, it could be criminal justice disparities, right? Such as we're seeing in our criminal justice system. That the Black Lives Matter movement is trying to address, inequitable school resource distribution, housing segregation, wage disparities, unequal media representation, right? Voter restrictions and repressions. And again, if we don't check the escalation of bigotry at that level, it will escalate to bias-motivated violence, threats, vandalism, arson, rape, assault, right? Murder and terrorism. And then, of course, at the top of the pyramid is genocide. Our former national director was a Holocaust survivor, and he used to always say that Auschwitz did not begin with words. It did not begin with bricks. It began with words, right? The gas chambers at Auschwitz weren't built with bricks. They were built with words that demonize, that dehumanize people, that other people, that marginalize people, right? Every single campaign of genocide in history was preceded by a campaign of words, right? The spread of ideas that demonize people, that scapegoat people for ills in our world, in our society, etc. Right? So we have to be very sensitive. We can't allow people to tell us, don't be so uptight, it's just a joke, right? It's just a funny cartoon, because that is the basis, but it always escalates to something more. Human beings are motivated in their behaviors by the things that we believe. And so when people internalize these ideas about Jews, about Black folks, about Muslims, about immigrants and refugees, it leads to them carrying out those ideas into violence, into discriminatory policies, etc. Right? So we have to be sensitive, even at those lower levels, to confront these things before they escalate. I want to conclude here with the next couple of slides, just to suggest a few ways that you all can be allies in your positions in student government, ways that you can be allies to the Jewish community and allies in the fight against anti-Semitism. First of all, as I said, it's really important to speak up, right? Bigotry always escalates, as we saw with the pyramid. As members of student government, you all have a bully pulpit, right? You command a certain moral authority. Which means that you have a certain extra responsibility to use the power of your office to condemn anti-Semitism explicitly, right? When something anti-Semitic happens, it's really important to call it out as anti-Semitism, as an assault on the Jewish community, right? We can't sort of all lives matter these issues. We have to name the specific form of hate. It's important that you all make efforts to voice solidarity with Jewish community, especially in these times when the Jewish community is feeling incredibly under threat, where our synagogues are being targeted, our Jewish community centers are being marked for mass murder, etc. And it's really important. I want to encourage you all to lead efforts on your campuses in partnership with the Jewish community to address the climate of intolerance on campus. That goes for anti-Semitism, but all forms of bigotry, because as we've seen, they're all interrelated. Number two, it's really important that we listen, right? It's important that we not go into a situation thinking we know what's best for another community, right? I've seen this happen over and over again on campuses where, white supremacist flyers show up, anti-Semitic threats are made, or some other kind of hate crime, might happen on a college campus, and the well-intentioned individuals who want to be allies to the Jewish community go ahead and organize a rally or take some other form of action without ever consulting the Jewish community. Please don't do that. We can't assume that we know what's best for other communities, so please show up but listen, right? The targets of an oppression must be centered in the discourse and action in response to that particular form of oppression, right? Which is to say that it's really important to center Jewish voices where it comes to anti-Semitism, right? And in doing so, please don't tokenize fringe voices, right? Seek out representative groups in the diverse Jewish community, right? We oftentimes see this happening. If you've been watching this political race and you've been watching some of the political events that have happened, tokenization is rife, right? It's happening, unfortunately, on both sides of the political spectrum. But don't elevate voices that are not representative of the mainstream views within the community, right? Be sure that you seek out diverse and representative voices. Number three, allyship means relationship, not one-off actions, right? It's really about developing a relationship with the Jewish community on campus, right? Reach out to Jewish groups and develop a partnership, develop that open lines of communication, develop a real working relationship, and include the Jewish community in coalitions on issues of mutual concern, right? Whether that's an issue of economic inequality, whether that's coalitions on environmental justice, racial justice, or anything else, please include the Jewish community. I know that at UC Santa Barbara, there have been instances where certain cultural fairs have happened or certain other types of activities have been organized that sort of represent the diversity on campus, but where Jewish organizations like Hillel, which is really the hub of Jewish life on campus, have been excluded, intentionally excluded, right? So please make sure to include the Jewish community in coalition building and type of community events, right? Number 4, educate yourselves, as we've been doing here, but also create opportunities to educate others. We really need allies to help do this work. The Jewish community is very small. We're 2% of the American population, but in terms of the global population, Jews are about, a little over 1/10 of 1% of the global population. We're a very small community. We're not going to solve the problem of anti-Semitism alone. We really need allies, right? Please take the opportunity to educate others about anti-Semitism. Please don't let the burden of educating others fall to the Jewish community, because we're really exhausted in having to do this, especially over the last 5 or so years. And of course, this goes for anti-Semitism, but also for other forms of bigotry, racism, homophobia, Islamophobia, misogyny, etc. Right? We really need to understand these phenomena, both in their commonalities and in their particularities, so that we can respond properly to them. Number 5, ensure that your campus has inclusive practices and policies, right? And that includes everything from, hate crimes response, but also simpler things like, are Jewish students able to make up a test if they need to miss a test because of a religious observance, right? Like Rosh Hashanah or Yom Kippur, right? It could be something as simple as that. Please be an advocate for Jewish people where they're just trying to get an education within a Christian context where Jewish holidays are not part of the civil calendar, right? But it's also more extreme things, like when a hate crime occurs on campus. Are there policies to ensure that the campus is properly prepared to respond, right? As members of the student government, you have the ability to help implement those things on your campus. So please do that. Number 6, it's really important to report incidents, right? In order to understand what's going on with anti-Semitism or with other forms of bigotry, we really need good data, right? And we can't get that data unless we have the help of the communities that we're trying to serve, right? So if you see something in your community, if you see a swastika graffiti, if you see white supremacist propaganda on your campus or in your community, if you see somebody harassing somebody with anti-Jewish sort of stereotypes or rhetoric, please report it. Report it to the ADL. You can go to adl.org/report. It's very easy. It takes about 2 minutes, probably less, to fill out a form, and then somebody from the local office will reach out to you and help you respond to that if you would like. You can also report anonymously. And of course, we take confidentiality very, very seriously. So please don't be afraid that if you report something, we will use your name or out you in some way as the person who reported it. We will never do that unless you expressly give us permission to use your name. And so on. Finally, number 7, build relationships with your local ADL office. We are here to support you, support the campus, support the community. We want to be a resource to you. There's a local office. Brianna's been on this presentation with us. There's representatives wherever you are during your time at college and after you leave the campus as well. There's always a local ADL office that covers your area. So please reach out, build a relationship, and we can work together to address the climate on campus and in our broader communities. Finally, I want to say that this is, of course, only scratched the surface of the subject of anti-Semitism. It's a huge subject, thousands of years of history. Academics spend their entire academic careers studying just one small aspect of anti-Semitism. So it's really impossible to do anything comprehensive in just, about 90 minutes time. So I want to say that, you should continue your education. A great way to do that is to use our new resource called Anti-Semitism Uncovered, which you can access at antisemitism.adl.org. We also have something called Hate Uncycled, which is a resource that goes beyond anti-Semitism to cover a lot of the types of issues that arise on campus, both having to do with racial issues of racism, but also controversial speakers of various kinds, the issues of hate speech versus free speech, and a whole host of other things. And this is both for students, student government, as well as administrators. So urge you to avail yourselves of those resources. I'm going to conclude there and open it up for questions. Maybe we can do a little bit of a Q&A and maybe get into a little bit of a discussion. So if you have a question, please raise your hand. We'll unmute you, and Yeah, and we'll get into it. Any questions? Everything was super clear. I covered it all, no question. Okay, yes, you and Lynn.
My question was in regards to form of address. Is it more polite to say, my question is related to form of address. So, I mean, is it more polite to say Jews or Jewish people, or are both fine?
Yeah, great question. Yeah, you know, Jew is sometimes used as a pejorative. Let's see. Oh, okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Perfect. Yeah. So Jew is sometimes used as a pejorative, right? It is never acceptable to use Jew as an adjective, right? Sometimes we've heard even elected officials say things in the you know, even in an official capacity, we've heard people say things like "Jew you down," right? He Jewed me down, meaning he treated me unfairly. He cheated me in some way, right? So never as an adjective. As a noun, it kind of depends on the tone with which it's said, right? If there's a certain sneer in the way that somebody says Jew, sometimes you kind of know that they mean it in a hostile way. But generally, you know, I'm a Jew. I'm a Jewish person, and that's a fine way to refer to Jews. By the way, the word Jew comes from Judah, right? Which comes from Yehuda, which is the name for the land where Jews come from, Judea, right? So that's where it comes from. But, generally speaking, if you want to be safe, it's always good to try to humanize people. So if you say Jewish people, right, it helps to humanize Jewish people. So I would urge you to use that form, but certainly Jew is not necessarily offensive. Kind of depends on the tone. Thanks for that question. Yeah. Other questions? Clarifying questions or things that maybe weren't covered, things that you're curious about?
We had a question about how folks can learn more about anti-Zionism versus anti-Semitism.
Yeah. Oh, did we lose Brianna? We might have lost Brianna. Yeah, so great question. I mean, I would say, you know, talk to Jewish people, right? That's always, I think, the best policy, right? Connect with individual Jewish people and engage them on the question of, what does Israel mean to you? What does Zionism mean to you, right? I can tell you, you know, I'm happy to share personally from my perspective. You know, I mentioned that in the country of my birth, 9 out of every 10 Jews were murdered during the Holocaust, right? You know, the Holocaust is something that still looms large in the Jewish psyche. It is something that looms large even in Jewish epigenetics, right? This notion of intergenerational or inherited trauma, right? Jews are kind of the case study for epigenetics in that regard. And so for Jewish people, you know, when we think about what happened, even just within living memory, right? This wasn't so long ago that the Holocaust happened. We realized that during that period, not a single country acted to stop the slaughter of Jewish people, right? You know, we know now in retrospect from history that people knew what was happening in the death camps in Europe, right? People in the United States were aware of what was happening, but not a single nation took military action to bomb the tracks to Auschwitz and other death camps to stop the slaughter of Jewish people en masse. Not a single country opened up its doors to Jewish refugees who wanted to flee, you know, to other parts of the world. Mostly, countries slammed the door in Jews' faces in our most desperate hour. Right. And so as a result of this, many Jews came to understand that Jewish safety and security would only be secured by other Jewish people, right? That we had to take it into our own hands. And that led many people to support Zionism, the idea that Jews should have a state with our own means of self-defense, right? Because at the end of the day, you know, if there was a Jewish state with a Jewish Air Force and military during the Holocaust, assuredly, they would have bombed the tracks. They would have tried to stop the slaughter, right? Assuredly, had Israel existed at the time as a Jewish state with the kind of immigration policies that it has today, which offer refuge to any endangered Jewish person, you know, in the world, who knows how many Jews could have survived. In fact, when we look at you know, when you apply kind of standard population growth figures to the Jewish population, we know that had the Holocaust not happened, or had people, countries taken drastic action to stop it, there'd be twice as many Jewish people alive today as there currently are. There's about 15 to 16 million Jews in the world today. There'd be over 30 million were it not for the Holocaust, which is to say that we are missing 1 out of every 2 of our Jewish brothers, sisters, aunts, mothers, grandparents, right? Half of the Jewish community is missing today. And so for many Jews, Zionism simply means survival, right? It simply means a place where we can run to should things get bad again, should there be another genocide, because Jewish history is rife with attempts to murder Jewish people en masse, right? Not just the Holocaust, not just the pogroms, not just the Inquisition, right? Engage people in these conversations, right? Jewish people are very open and willing to talk about their identity, what Israel means to them, what Zionism means to them. So please engage with actual live humans and ask them their opinion on these things, right? I think that's probably the best way to understand these issues better, is actually like, we need dialogue. We really need to see one another as human beings with real concerns, real interests, real challenges in life, real fears, right? And we need to take those seriously. And I think dialogue is the best way to do that. Other questions? Controversial, maybe, questions, things you want to challenge me on, or anything goes. Whatever questions you all might still have lingering, certainly happy to answer. If you want to just raise your hand or throw it in the chat. All right, no more questions. All right, so we'll probably wrap up here. If you do want to follow up, and ask some further questions, you want to seek out some additional resources, as I said, please reach out to us. Please form a relationship with our local ADL office. We're here to help. We're here to provide resources, to act assistance, to help, to help guide you when, God forbid, if an incident should occur at UCSB or in the broader community. So please lean on us. Please help us, help us help you. Thanks very much. I really appreciate you all taking the time out of your day to come and become a little bit more educated about the subject of anti-Semitism. I hope that this has been meaningful to you. I hope you've learned something. Let's continue the discussion. Let's continue the relationship. And I hope to engage with you all again soon. Thanks very much.